A grieving millionaire visits his son's grave, seeking peace and solitude. But when he finds a young man standing there, silently weeping, the encounter sets off a chain of events that will unravel painful truths and family secrets and lead to a heart-wrenching confrontation that no one could have predicted. What the millionaire discovers will shake him to the core and change both their lives forever. Title: A millionaire finds a young man at his son's grave. You won't believe what happened next. The story begins with Jonathan Price, a man who had built an empire from scratch. He was a self-made millionaire with everything: wealth, power, respect, but none of it could fill the void left by his son's untimely death. His son, David, had been the light of his life, the one person Jonathan had hoped would carry on his legacy. But David had died tragically in a car accident a year ago, and Jonathan had never been the same since. Every week, Jonathan visited David's grave, leaving flowers and sitting for hours, just talking to his son. It was the only place where he felt connected to him. His wife, Margaret, had coped by throwing herself into charity work, but Jonathan found no comfort in distractions. He was consumed by his grief, and every visit to the grave felt like reliving the day he lost David all over again. On a cold, gray morning, Jonathan arrived at the cemetery as usual. The sun was barely up, and the fog hung low, making the place feel eerie and quiet. As he approached his son's grave, something caught his eye. Someone was already there. A young man, around David's age, stood before the tombstone, his head bowed and shoulders trembling as if he was crying. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He had never seen this person before. Who was this stranger, and why was he here? Anger and curiosity bubbled up in Jonathan's chest. How dare someone intrude on this private space, his sanctuary of grief? He stepped closer, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. The young man didn't move. Who are you? Jonathan's voice was sharp, cutting through the stillness. Why are you at my son's grave? The young man slowly turned around, his eyes red and swollen from crying. There was a deep sadness in his expression, but also something else, a look of guilt, or maybe fear. I'm sorry, the young man whispered. I didn't mean to intrude. I had to see him. Jonathan frowned, his anger softening into confusion. You knew my son? The young man nodded, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Yes, sir. He was my best friend. The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. Best friend? He had never heard David mention this young man before. David's circle of friends had been small, consisting mainly of people from their wealthy social circles, and yet here stood someone who looked nothing like those people. His clothes were simple, worn, and he seemed nervous, out of place in this polished cemetery. What's your name? Jonathan asked, his tone softer now but still guarded. The young man hesitated before answering. My name is Ethan. Ethan Walker. Jonathan searched his memory, but the name didn't ring a bell. I don't remember David mentioning you. Ethan looked down, fidgeting with his hands. We weren't friends for very long. But he meant a lot to me, and I wanted to pay my respects. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. There was something off about Ethan, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. How did you meet my son? Ethan hesitated again, glancing at the grave as if he were afraid to speak. We met, through someone else. I'd rather not go into it, if that's okay. The vagueness of Ethan's response only fueled Jonathan's suspicion. But before he could press further, Ethan turned toward the grave, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Price. David was a good person. He didn't deserve what happened to him." Jonathan's heart twisted painfully. "No," he whispered, "he didn't." There was a long, uncomfortable silence before Ethan wiped his face again and muttered, "I should go." Without waiting for a response, Ethan hurried away, disappearing into the fog. As Jonathan drove home, Ethan's words echoed in his mind. The encounter had stirred something in him, something dark and unsettling. Why had David never mentioned Ethan? And why had the young man seemed so nervous, so full of sorrow? Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He needed answers. That night, he told Margaret about the encounter, but she dismissed it as a coincidence, just another grieving friend. Jonathan, however, was not convinced. He decided to do some digging. The next day, Jonathan hired a private investigator to look into Ethan Walker. Days passed with no news, and Jonathan's obsession grew. He visited David's grave more frequently, half expecting to see Ethan there again. But the young man never returned. Then, one evening, the investigator called. What he revealed sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. "Mr. Price," the investigator began, "I found out a few things about Ethan Walker. He's not who he seems." Jonathan gripped the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" "He comes from a troubled background. His father was involved in some criminal activities, and Ethan himself has had a rough life. But here's the kicker, he and David knew each other through more than just friendship. There's evidence suggesting that Ethan might have been involved in David's accident." Jonathan felt his blood run cold. "What? Are you saying he killed my son?" "I'm not sure. But there are some strange connections. Ethan was seen arguing with David the night of the accident. There were rumors that David was helping Ethan with something dangerous." Furious and overwhelmed, Jonathan couldn't sit back any longer. He needed to confront Ethan, to demand the truth. He returned to the cemetery, hoping to find the young man there again. Sure enough, Ethan was at David's grave, kneeling in front of the tombstone with his head bowed. Jonathan stormed over, his voice trembling with rage. You were there the night he died, weren't you?" Ethan's head snapped up, his face pale. "Mr. Price, please. Don't lie to me," Jonathan shouted. "What happened that night? Were you involved in my son's death?" Ethan stood, shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. "No. I didn't kill David. I swear, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Jonathan grabbed Ethan by the collar, his grief and anger boiling over. "Tell me the truth." Ethan sobbed, barely able to speak. "David, he was trying to help me. I was in trouble, deep trouble, and he was the only one who believed in me. But things went wrong, and now he's gone because of me." Jonathan's grip loosened as the truth began to sink in. "What kind of trouble?" Ethan wiped his tears, his voice barely a whisper. "David was helping me get out of a bad situation with some dangerous people. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to worry you. But that night, things went south, and the accident happened. It was my fault. I shouldn't have dragged him into it." Jonathan was stunned, his heart breaking all over again. His son had died trying to help this young man, and now Ethan was standing here, consumed by guilt. "I'm so sorry," Ethan whispered. "If I could trade places with him, I would. I didn't want any of this to happen." Jonathan, still trembling with anger and grief, took a step back. He wanted to hate Ethan, to blame him for everything, but deep down, he knew that. Weeks passed after Jonathan's confrontation with Ethan. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation, about how his son had risked his life for someone else. Jonathan felt a storm of conflicting emotions, rage, sorrow, guilt, but above all, he realized that holding on to his anger wouldn't bring David back. One evening, Jonathan returned to the cemetery. This time, instead of demanding answers, he sought something else, closure. He found Ethan sitting at David's grave again, as if he hadn't left since their last encounter. Jonathan approached quietly and sat beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for what happened. But David believed in you. And I need to believe that he saw something in you worth saving." Ethan looked at him, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'll never forgive myself, Mr. Price. But if there's anything I can do, anything to make this right, I'll do it." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Maybe the best way to honor David is to make sure you don't waste the life he saved." In the months that followed, Jonathan began to mentor Ethan, helping him get his life back on track. Ethan worked hard to turn his life around, driven by the guilt of David's death, but also by a desire to live up to the faith David had placed in him. The process wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks along the way. But as time passed, both men found a measure of peace in their shared grief. Jonathan realized that in helping Ethan, he was also healing himself. 1 year after their first meeting, Jonathan and Ethan stood side by side at David's grave. This time, the air was lighter, and the fog had lifted. The cemetery, once a place of sorrow, now felt like a place of reflection and remembrance. Jonathan placed a fresh bouquet of flowers on the grave, then looked at Ethan. "You've come a long way." Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jonathan smiled sadly. "You couldn't have done it without David." As they stood there in silence, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He had lost his son, and that pain would never fully fade, but in helping Ethan, he had found a way to keep David's memory alive. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy his son could have left behind, not wealth or power, but the power to change a life for the better. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan took one last look at David's grave, whispering, "Rest easy, my son. I'll carry your light forward." With Ethan by his side, Jonathan walked away from the cemetery, leaving behind not just a grave, but a chapter of his life filled with pain and loss. But ahead of them lay something new, hope, redemption, and the possibility of a brighter future. The end. It started as a cruel game, an attempt to degrade and embarrass. He thought it would be fun to watch her struggle on the golf course, a sport of privilege and status. But in a single, unforgettable moment, she silenced the laughter, leaving the entire club speechless. Title: A millionaire invites his black housekeeper to golf to humiliate her. But what she does stuns everyone. James Holloway, a self-made millionaire in his early 50s, embodied wealth and status. He lived in a sprawling mansion, owned luxurious cars, and was a proud member of the exclusive Stonebridge Golf Club, where the elite mingled and played. Holloway had always enjoyed a sense of superiority, relishing in the power his money afforded him. Though he came from humble beginnings, his rise to success had changed him, making him cold and dismissive toward those beneath him. His household staff, including his black housekeeper, Lydia Williams, was often on the receiving end of his condescending behavior. Lydia, however, was a woman of quiet strength. In her early 40s, she carried herself with grace despite the demeaning treatment she received. She had worked for Holloway for over a decade, enduring his snide remarks and the subtle racism that came with them. Though she needed the job to support her family, Lydia never let Holloway's cruelty break her spirit. Holloway had recently returned from a business trip and was feeling particularly bored. One evening, after too many glasses of whiskey, he came up with a twisted idea to amuse himself. Why not invite Lydia to play golf at the exclusive club? The image of her fumbling with golf clubs and looking out of place among his wealthy friends seemed to promise endless amusement. The next morning, while Lydia was tidying the living room, Holloway called her over. "How would you like to join me for a round of golf tomorrow, Lydia?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "It's a rare chance to visit a place like Stonebridge. I'm sure you'll fit right in." Lydia hesitated, sensing the insult beneath his words. She knew this was a setup, an attempt to embarrass her in front of his elite friends. Yet, something in her told her to accept the challenge. Perhaps it was her pride, or maybe it was the look in his eyes, daring her to refuse. So, with a calm demeanor, she nodded. "Sure, Mr. Holloway. I'll be there." The next day, Lydia arrived at Stonebridge Golf Club dressed in modest, yet neat attire. Holloway had not bothered to provide her with proper golfing clothes, clearly hoping she'd stand out as a spectacle. As she approached the entrance, she could feel the curious eyes of the members upon her. Whispers followed her steps. Who was this woman, and why was she here? Holloway greeted her with a smug smile. His group of friends, including his business partner, Gerald, and several wealthy acquaintances, were already waiting near the first tee. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a golf game, it was a performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holloway announced, "I've invited my housekeeper, Lydia, to join us today. I thought it would be fun to see how she handles herself on the course." A few chuckles rippled through the group. Gerald gave Holloway a knowing look, already anticipating the spectacle that was about to unfold. Holloway handed Lydia a club, watching as she weighed it in her hands. He could barely hide his grin. "Let's see what you've got, Lydia." She said nothing, only giving him a calm nod. The first hole was a par 4 with a straight shot down the fairway. Holloway stepped up first, hitting a solid drive that soared down the green, followed by his friends, who each took their swings with varying degrees of skill. Then it was Lydia's turn. Holloway's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Don't worry if it doesn't go far. It's all about having fun." Lydia stepped up to the tee, her expression calm and focused. She had watched golf on television before but had never set foot on a course. Yet, as she stood there, gripping the club, a quiet determination settled over her. She took a deep breath, recalling the fluid motion of the professional players she had seen. Then, with a smooth swing, she struck the ball. The sound of the impact was sharp and clean, and to everyone's astonishment, the ball flew straight and true, landing farther down the fairway than any of the men's shots. There was a stunned silence. Holloway's smile faltered. His friends exchanged shocked glances. Gerald, who had been halfway through a sip of his drink, nearly choked. Holloway's eyes narrowed, but he quickly brushed it off, pretending it was a fluke. "Lucky shot," he muttered under his breath, leading the group down the fairway. As the game progressed, however, it became clear that Lydia's first shot had not been luck. Hole after hole, she played with remarkable precision, outdriving and outplaying Holloway and his friends. Her form was surprisingly good for someone who had never held a golf club before. With each swing, she moved with a quiet confidence that unnerved them all. The atmosphere shifted from amusement to confusion, and soon, discomfort. By the 9th hole, Holloway was fuming. His ego, once inflated by the prospect of humiliating his housekeeper, was now bruised and battered. Lydia's calm demeanor throughout the game only made it worse. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, she simply played, letting her actions speak louder than any words. As they reached the final hole, a par 5 with a challenging water hazard, the tension was palpable. Holloway was determined to win this last round, if only to salvage some pride. He hit his ball with all the force he could muster, but it sliced to the right, landing in the rough near the trees. His friends didn't fare much better, their shots falling short of the green. Lydia stepped up, and this time, the entire group fell silent, watching her every move. She assessed the distance, then, with an effortless swing, sent the ball soaring through the air. It cleared the water hazard with ease and landed gracefully on the green, inches from the hole. The onlookers were stunned. A slow clap echoed from behind. The club's head pro, who had been watching from a distance, approached. He had seen the entire game and was visibly impressed. "That was an incredible shot," he said, nodding to Lydia. "Have you ever considered playing professionally?" Lydia gave a small smile. "No, just lucky today, I guess." But everyone knew it wasn't luck. Holloway's face was a mask of barely contained fury, his humiliation complete. He had set out to mock Lydia, to show her that she was out of place in his world, but in the end, it was he who was out of his depth. After the game, the group gathered at the clubhouse for drinks. Holloway, still smarting from his defeat, was unusually quiet. Gerald, always the opportunist, couldn't resist a jab. "Looks like you brought the wrong person to humiliate today, James." Holloway glared at him but said nothing. Lydia, meanwhile, sat quietly, sipping a glass of water. She didn't need to say a word, her performance on the course had spoken for her. As the evening wore on, Holloway's anger began to shift into something else, fear. Lydia had shattered his carefully constructed image of superiority, and now he realized how vulnerable he was. She had proven herself not only capable but formidable in a space he had never expected. He had underestimated her, and now, he feared the consequences. In the days that followed, Holloway's attitude toward Lydia changed dramatically. He became distant, almost avoiding her in his own home. The staff noticed, too, whispering among themselves about how the boss had been bested by the housekeeper. Holloway, for the first time, felt the weight of his own arrogance. He had always believed that money and status made him untouchable, but Lydia had shown him otherwise. As for Lydia, she returned to her duties as usual, her quiet strength unchanged. The game had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that dignity, skill, and character couldn't be bought or humiliated away. And though Holloway never spoke of that day again, it lingered in the air, an unspoken victory for Lydia, who had shown them all that true power comes from within. The end. The rain drummed against the windows as Adrian Royce, a self-made millionaire known for his cold, calculated demeanor, entered his sister Amelia's home. It was supposed to be a brief visit, drop off some gifts for his nieces, exchange a few words, and leave as swiftly as he arrived. But what he saw in that moment stopped him in his tracks, flooding his mind with memories and igniting a fire within him he hadn't felt in years. There, kneeling on the cold, tiled floor, his sister was scrubbing furiously, her eyes red from crying. Her hands, trembling from exhaustion, moved mechanically as if she were desperate to erase something far more profound than dirt. Standing in the doorway, with a cruel sneer and crossed arms, was Thomas, her husband. His brother-in-law. Adrian's gaze darkened. Something inside him snapped, something primal and protective. He had come for a simple visit, but now, he was going to leave everyone in that house horrified by what he was about to do. Title: A millionaire entered his brother-in-law's house and saw his sister crying while cleaning the floor. He left everyone horrified with what he did. Amelia and Adrian Royce had always shared a close bond. Growing up in a poor neighborhood, they relied on each other through the trials and tribulations of their harsh upbringing. Their parents had died in a tragic car accident when they were teenagers, leaving the two siblings to fend for themselves. Adrian, with a fierce determination, had pulled them out of poverty. Through sheer grit and intelligence, he built a fortune in the tech industry, becoming one of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in the country. Yet, despite his wealth and success, he remained grounded, especially when it came to Amelia. She was his heart, the only family he had left, and he adored her. But Amelia's marriage to Thomas had always troubled Adrian. Thomas was a man of charm, but it was the kind of charm that concealed something darker. He had a knack for manipulating people, bending them to his will with ease. When they first married, Adrian gave Thomas the benefit of the doubt, hoping his instincts were wrong. But over the years, he had seen glimpses of Thomas's true nature, controlling, demeaning, and emotionally abusive. Amelia, a once vibrant and confident woman, had become a shadow of her former self. Every time Adrian visited, he noticed subtle signs of her unhappiness, a forced smile, an anxious glance toward her husband, bruises she explained away as accidents. But she never spoke ill of Thomas, always defending him, always making excuses. Adrian tried to help in his own way, offering financial support and urging Amelia to leave if things ever got bad. She always declined, saying she loved Thomas and that he would change. That was until today. The sight of his sister scrubbing the floor in such a broken state, her tears mixing with the soapy water, shattered the thin veneer of normalcy. The house, once filled with the laughter of his nieces and the warmth of family, now felt cold, oppressive, like a prison. Adrian knelt beside Amelia, gently lifting her chin to meet his eyes. "Amelia, what's going on?" She hesitated, her lower lip trembling, her eyes flicking nervously toward Thomas. "It's nothing, Adrian. I'm fine." "Really?" Thomas, still standing in the doorway, let out a low chuckle. "It's nothing, Adrian. Just a little misunderstanding. You know how emotional she can get." Adrian's jaw tightened. He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact with his brother-in-law. "What did you do to her, Thomas?" Thomas smirked, his eyes glinting with mockery. "You're always so quick to assume the worst. You think money gives you the right to judge my marriage? You don't know anything about us." Amelia stood shakily, her hands twisting the rag she had been using. "Please, Adrian, let's just leave it alone. I don't want to make things worse." But Adrian couldn't let it go. Years of pent-up anger, frustration, and guilt boiled to the surface. He had stood by too long, watched his sister suffer in silence. His fortune may have given him power in the business world, but here, in his sister's life, he had felt powerless. No more. "Amelia, pack your things," he said, his voice low but firm. "What?" Amelia blinked, confusion and fear clouding her expression. "Adrian, what are you talking about?" "You're leaving with me," Adrian replied, stepping between her and Thomas. "Tonight." Thomas's face darkened, and he took a menacing step forward. "She's not going anywhere, Adrian. This is my house, and she's my wife. You don't get to come in here and make demands." Adrian's eyes burned with a cold fury. "I'm not asking for your permission." The room was thick with tension. Amelia looked between the two men, torn between the brother who had always protected her and the husband she had promised to stand by. Her hands trembled as she clutched the rag, her mind spinning. Suddenly, Thomas's mask of calm cracked. He lunged forward, grabbing Amelia by the arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "You're not leaving," he hissed through clenched teeth. Adrian moved faster than he ever had before. In a flash, he grabbed Thomas by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The sound of the impact echoed through the house, and for a moment, everything was still. Adrian's voice was ice. "Don't you dare touch her again." Thomas laughed, though there was fear behind his eyes now. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? The rich brother coming to save the damsel in distress. You have no idea what our life is like. She's not your responsibility. She's mine." "Not anymore," Adrian growled. "You've had your chance to be a decent husband. Now, she's coming with me." Amelia's breath hitched as she watched the confrontation. She had never seen her brother like this, so fierce, so unrelenting. Her heart pounded in her chest, torn between loyalty to her marriage vows and the overwhelming need to escape the prison her life had become. The tension broke as the front door swung open, and the sound of tiny footsteps filled the hallway. Amelia's two young daughters, Lily and Emily, came running into the room, their laughter a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. "Mommy! Uncle Adrian," they squealed, running up to their mother and wrapping their arms around her legs. Adrian's eyes softened as he looked down at his nieces, their innocence piercing through the darkness of the moment. For a brief second, the house felt like a home again. But Thomas wasn't finished. He straightened his collar, glaring at Adrian with venom. "You think you can just take her? What about the kids? What are you going to do, break up their family?" The question hung in the air, heavy and painful. Amelia's heart wrenched as she looked at her daughters, their bright eyes full of love and trust. Could she really tear them away from their father? Could she uproot their lives because of her own suffering? I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Adrian, I can't leave them." Adrian looked at his sister, seeing the weight of the world on her shoulders. He could feel the conflict raging inside her, the guilt, the fear, the love for her children. But he also knew that if she stayed, the cycle of abuse would continue, and it would only be a matter of time before her daughters became collateral damage. He knelt down, placing a hand gently on Amelia's shoulder. "Amelia, listen to me. You can still be a mother to them, but you don't have to stay here. You deserve better than this." Thomas scoffed. "You really think you can give her a better life? Money doesn't fix everything, Adrian. You'll ruin her." You'll ruin them. Adrian stood, his eyes steely. I may not be able to fix everything, but I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family. And that includes making sure they're safe from you. With that, Adrian turned to Amelia once more. We'll figure it out. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. She had spent so many years convincing herself that this was her life, that there was no way out. But now, standing between her brother and her husband, she realized something profound. She didn't have to keep sacrificing herself for the sake of an illusion. She could choose to leave. She could choose to be free. It wasn't easy. That night was only the beginning of a long and painful process. Amelia packed her things, took her daughters, and left the house she had once called home. There were tears, arguments, and moments of doubt. But through it all, Adrian was there, supporting her, guiding her, reminding her that she was stronger than she knew. Thomas fought back, of course. He tried to manipulate the situation, turning it into a legal battle, trying to use the children as leverage. But Adrian's wealth and influence ensured that Amelia had the best legal representation, and over time, Thomas's grip on their lives weakened. In the end, Amelia was awarded full custody of the children, and with Adrian's help, she rebuilt her life. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she first married Thomas, but it was a life filled with peace, security, and love, the kind of love that her brother had always shown her. As for Adrian, the events of that night changed him too. He had always thought that money and success were the measures of a man's worth, but he realized that real wealth came from the people you protect, the family you stand by, no matter the cost. And as he watched his sister and nieces thrive, he knew that in saving them, he had saved himself too. The end. Christmas lights twinkled in the frosty night, and soft carols filled the air, but for 34-year-old Claire Harper, the festive cheer was just another reminder of her loneliness. She had been burned too many times in love, and the thought of trying again seemed foolish. Yet, when her best friend Sarah begged her to go on a blind date on Christmas Eve, claiming it might be the miracle she needed, Claire reluctantly agreed. Little did she know, this one decision would change her life forever in ways she could never have imagined. A woman unlucky in love agrees to go on a blind date on Christmas Eve, but when she arrives, she discovers her date is. Claire sat in her cozy apartment, staring at her phone. It was 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve, and she was dressed in a simple red dress Sarah had picked for her. She wasn't sure what she hated more, blind dates or the awkwardness that came with them. After years of heartbreak, her fiancé leaving her at the altar, a 2-year relationship ending when her partner cheated, Claire had sworn off love. Sarah had insisted, this guy, James, is different. He's smart, charming, and looking for someone like you. Trust me, Claire, you need this. Reluctantly, Claire agreed. She sighed as she grabbed her purse and headed out into the snowy night, still skeptical of the so-called Christmas magic Sarah believed in. The mysterious invitation. The restaurant, the Silver Bell, was cozy and elegant, with fairy lights wrapped around every corner. Claire stepped inside, brushing off the snow from her coat. The hostess guided her to a secluded table by the window, where a single envelope awaited her. The note inside read, Claire, I'll be a little late. Order something warm and enjoy the music. Can't wait to meet you. James. Claire frowned. This wasn't a great start. Who arrives late for a first date on Christmas Eve? But the soft hum of a jazz band and the aroma of freshly baked bread lulled her into staying. Minutes turned into an hour, and Claire's patience wore thin. Just as she was about to leave, a tall man in a sharp black coat approached her table. "Claire Harper?" he asked, his voice deep and soothing. Claire looked up, confused. "Yes. Are you James?" The man smiled but shook his head. "No, I'm Alex. James couldn't make it, so he sent me instead." Claire's heart sank. This was a first, a blind date sending a substitute. She opened her mouth to object but stopped. There was something oddly familiar about Alex's piercing green eyes and crooked smile. Unfolding the mystery. As the night went on, Alex proved to be delightful company. He was witty, well-read, and seemed to know exactly how to make Claire laugh. Despite her initial annoyance, she found herself enjoying the conversation. "I have to admit," Alex said, leaning closer, "I wasn't expecting someone as charming as you." Claire blushed but quickly shifted the subject. "So, how do you know James?" Alex hesitated. "It's complicated. Let's just say he and I go way back." The vagueness of his response planted a seed of suspicion in Claire's mind. Who was this man? Why had James sent him? After dessert, Alex invited Claire to take a walk through the Christmas market nearby. The night was magical, with snowflakes dancing in the air and children laughing around a giant Christmas tree. Claire felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. As they strolled, Alex suddenly grew serious. "Claire, there's something I need to tell you." Her stomach churned. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "James doesn't exist. He's me. I made up the name because I didn't think you'd agree to meet me otherwise." Claire froze. "Why would you lie about that? Who are you really?" "I'm Alex Carter," he said softly. "Your ex-fiancé's brother." The world seemed to tilt beneath Claire's feet. Memories of her shattered engagement flooded back. Alex had been at the periphery of her life back then, a shadow she never truly noticed. "You have some nerve," she said, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this?" Alex looked genuinely remorseful. "I know how much my brother hurt you, and I hate him for it. But I've also regretted not stepping in when I saw the signs. I wanted to make it right." "By tricking me into a date?" Claire snapped. "How is that making anything right?" "I wanted a chance to show you that not all men are like him," Alex said earnestly. "I've cared about you for years, Claire. I just didn't know how to tell you." Claire's emotions were a whirlwind. Anger, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. Could she trust him? Before Claire could respond, a commotion broke out near the market's entrance. A man in a hooded jacket stormed toward them, yelling Alex's name. "Alex. You think you can just walk away from this?" It was Alex's estranged business partner, Daniel, who accused him of betraying their company. As Daniel's voice grew louder, secrets about Alex's troubled past and financial scandals began spilling out, leaving Claire stunned. "Is any of this true?" Claire demanded. Alex looked torn. "Some of it, yes. But it's not what you think." "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her heart sinking. Claire walked away, needing time to process everything. Alex's confession and the drama that followed left her questioning her instincts. On Christmas morning, a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Alex holding a small box. I know I don't deserve your trust, he began. But I couldn't let Christmas go by without telling you how much you mean to me. This is my mother's bracelet. She always said it should go to someone I truly care about. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She took the box but said nothing. I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes, Alex said before walking away. Months passed. Claire focused on herself, trying to untangle her feelings. Slowly, she realized that despite Alex's flaws and mistakes, he had been honest about his feelings for her. On a sunny spring morning, Claire found herself at a cafe, dialing a number she hadn't used in months. Alex? Are you free for coffee? Their story didn't have a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a chance to build something real, this time with no secrets between them. Years later, Claire and Alex stood hand in hand, watching their daughter place the star on their Christmas tree. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Do you believe in Christmas miracles now? Alex teased. Claire smiled. I believe in second chances. The end.